Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga has revealed that 50,228 primary school learners and 108,660 secondary school pupils haven't returned to school this year. These worrying figures don't include the Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga. For more on the school dropouts, we're joined now by the South African Union for Students, President Yandisa, Lubabalo, education expert Prof. Brahm, Fleisch, as well as EXCO member and education technology manager Rian van der Berg. Gentlemen, good evening and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Let's begin with you, Lubabalo. I mean, what are the factors, as far as students are concerned, that lead to students or even their families making this difficult choice of them not returning, even though they are of compulsory school-going age?
No, first thing, let me greet you and greet the listeners and the viewers. I think one thing we must then pay attention to is the fact that this is affecting mostly public schools in which learners are going to. There are many conditions in which lead to young people not going to school. The high level of unemployment, the conditions in the school, and even the conditions at home. And sometimes the lack of support by government to these learners. So there are quite a number of issues. And as the union, we are very hurt because this directly speaks to the number of graduates that we are producing and the number of first years that we are actually taking in. Meaning that there's not enough support in schools, there's not enough support in the system to make sure that these young people actually get into the system and graduate on time.
So how are we responding as far as strategies are concerned, right? Is it adequate, for example, for the department to say, well, the schools know who the pupils are, they know their parents, and they know who didn't return, and therefore the schools are the ones that should be responding to this challenge? Are schools able, do they have the capacity to respond to this challenge?
It speaks directly to what I'm saying. Of capacity and enough support to be able to follow up the pupils. For an example, if the schools are aware of the people that have not returned, it should then be a concern of government to say, where are these young people? What are they actually doing with their lives? Because they might be out there, not because they wish to be out there, but they are out there because of conditions. Now, the fact that government just says that we know that so many people are not back in school, but we just leave them to be, it shows that there's not enough support in the schools to make sure that these young people are actually taken into classroom. You know, there are many conditions that might lead to a young person leaving a classroom and going to the streets or going to wherever these young people are. So it is the responsibility of government to make sure that we must go and find these young people and make sure that they are back in classroom and they should be doing what they're supposed to be doing, not be out there in the streets.
Professor Brahm, there is, of course, something which we call in the country a zero dropout campaign, which reveals a number of issues that young learners are financially dealing with. Some of them Lubabalo has already raised. One is financial reasons. The other is, of course, loss of parents during this COVID-19. And the other reason for dropping out is teenage pregnancy. Are we addressing all these issues adequately as far as the support that is necessary to be given to the learners?
So, if I may, I want to just take us back a little bit to the kind of period before the pandemic. I think it's important to recognize that South Africa had a very successful experience with access to schooling of children of compulsory school age. From age 7 to 15, we had essentially full enrollment. There were clearly some children, particularly children with disabilities in rural areas who were not in schools, but largely the overwhelming majority of South Africans were going to school from the ages of 7 to 15, which is our compulsory school ban. We then see a substantial dropout of school at age 16, 17, 18. So I think is that particularly for children at grade 7, according to the story that you're reporting, there's been a significant decline in the number of learners in that age group. I think it's premature to make too many claims about this. It's 2 months since we've had kind of full return to school. We're now just beginning to go back to regular teaching in the same way. And I suspect that over time we'll see a return of particularly children in the primary schools to school. There are obviously go to online schooling. Probably a very small percentage of those kids, where the 50,000 who are not currently enrolled, are in these online institutions. But I suspect that over time, when schools begin to return to the normal routines, when things begin to stabilize, I think children will come back. Parents obviously anxious. They're not sure what the situation, whether there'll be another wave of COVID. So I think that we're just in a transitional time as we return to normal schooling. And I think many of the children, particularly the grade 7s, will eventually come back to school. The impact of missing months obviously is something altogether different, and I think we need to be addressing that.
Yeah.
There is clearly an issue for older children, children in the high school, and the problem was evident even before COVID, that there are a significant portion of children who, by the time they get to 16, 17, are dropping out of school. And I think that we obviously we need to look at what kinds of support that we can give to those learners.
Yeah. So you're saying that the re-entry of particularly those in grade 7, I think also grade 10 and grade 11 is what being cited, but a large number of them being in grade 7, is something that can be easily managed by the schools themselves. They can just track those learners. It would be easy to find them and recover them and bring them back.
And not so much easy once they get back. I mean, children who have missed essentially 2 years of schooling, there's going to be huge backlogs. And the system is going to have to address the fact that many children who have been out of school, haven't received any substantial and consistent schooling, will have massive deficits. We certainly won't be able to manage the curriculum as usual, particularly for children who probably are delayed in their return to schools. Many of them probably didn't come on a regular basis during the last year when there was some intermittent schooling. So I think that children will come back. There's a different issue about once they're back, how do we address the backlogs of learning that many of those children will have to address if they're going to succeed in the school system.
All right. Rian, what's your view then on the strategies being implemented? One, first, to track learners who are out of the schooling system, but two, to manage their re-entry into the school and ensure that the focus is on ensuring that they catch up, irrespective of what conditions and background they're coming from.
Yes, I think I want to agree with Prof. Brahm that I think it's a layered approach. The one is, are the learners maybe coming back at a later stage? So we've got a number, 160,000, that might not yet have returned, and they might still at a later stage return. The second thing on that is that we should have data of those, and I'm concerned about if we have the data, we know the number, we should know the learners as well, and the schools can respond to that. The second part of the question, I think we've got to ensure that schools are safe, and I think that's still a concern for some parents. So schools should be a safe place, so it should be properly managed, governed, sanitation, PPE, the whole bang should be there. And that will ensure that kids might return. The second one of that is we're struggling in many provinces with overcrowding in classrooms. So there might be an appetite to return, but the classroom is overcrowded and we can't return with some sort of social distancing and space between learners. And I think we're very keen from FETSA's side to have a look at where the department is creating extra capacity as far as infrastructure goes. So if a classroom has more than 40 learners in, which should not happen, and now they've got a crowd into a space that's too small with social distancing, I think that is also a point that needs to be raised. So we're very pro looking at how can we create more infrastructure capacity so that it's a safe space to work in. The third one is how do we deal with the catch-up? And I think we've got to look at ourselves as a sector and and apply more of the blended learning, not call it online learning or just remote learning, but a blended approach to ensuring that we catch up faster. Some statistics essay report that came out during the week said that only 11.7% of schools continued with learning during 2020. I don't know what the number is for 2021, but that is an alarming number of learners that have actually had access to call it technological infrastructure by means of cell phones or data or even zero-rated programs and have not participated in that. So I think we've got to put a big emphasis on the catch-up and look at the blended model of that as well.
Right. How do we ensure that we get them back in class and keep them in class? That's most important.
Yes, I think communities have got to stand up. I think we've got to look at community leaders speaking to the communities, faith-based leaders, community leaders saying, this is important for our learners to get back to school and back to class. We've got to remember that attendance does not ensure learning and engagement. We saw that with the schools that continued with remote learning. But non-attendance and non-participation in a different program definitely correlates with no engagement. So we're really looking at parents, understanding this problem, sending kids and caregivers, sending kids back to school. We've got to have community leaders standing up and say we don't want to create a pandemic a few years from now, which is called an academic pandemic, with kids not returning to school. So I think the society has got to take charge of this. Yes, government has an uphill battle and government needs to step up with some sort of policy and infrastructure. But I think it's up to people to return to school. But we've got to understand the reasons why they might not have gotten back to school. And I think that's where the data must speak far more clearly.
Yeah. Lubabalo, do you see a situation where we will be moving to a different delivery vehicle of education? So as we're speaking of refining how learners are going to be receiving educations going forward, do you think there is space for us to look at a different vehicle, particularly if we are talking for that group, the cohort that you're talking about, public schools, poor communities that do not have the resources or the infrastructure?
I'm not sure if you addressed the question to me. Sorry, I actually think we need to recognize that.
Prof, okay, you can go for it. I think Lubabalo is having a challenge. Come back to me in a moment.
So
I'm not sure.
Yes, no, Lubabalo is live there. He's giving us technical glitches. Lubabalo? Let's take a break. We'll come back and try and get you on a better line there. In conversation tonight with the South African Union for Student President Yandisa, Lubabalo, education expert Brahm, Prof. Brahm Fleisch, and EXCO member and education technology manager at FETSAS, Rian Fabio. Stay with us. Back tonight, discussing those shocking statistics revealed by the Department of Basic Education. 160,000 pupils did not return to public schools this year. Prof. Brahm Fleisch saying not to panic too much at this particular time. We should give it time. It's still early days. Those numbers will certainly improve. But let's talk then further on what are the possibilities of refining the delivery vehicles of education, particularly within public schools in the township. Yandisa, can you see township schools moving to a more refined delivery vehicles of education?
No. I think first I must register on point that I am worried when the two speakers are saying that probably it's a matter of time learners will come back over time. I mean, it's March now. In the few days it will be March. If learners are not back in classroom now, it should be worrying to everyone. It shows that there is a problem beyond them not coming to classroom. Of course, them moving to more refined, it speaks onto the issue of capacity in schools and the capacity given by communities and government to those schools. Before we even determine, it's already difficult with universities to make sure that all people are getting a final education at home. So if you are talking about learners now, it speaks out to capacity. If we are unable at this stage to trace young people who are not back in classroom, it then shows that we have challenges. Now, I don't say at any point in time, particularly in the public schools, in which they are the ones that are highly affected, I don't see us moving closer to any finer methods of learning at this moment, because it shows that we have a capacity issue that we must look into in making sure we deliver a proper education to learners.
Yeah. Prof, probably wanted to weigh in on that. I mean, with the amount of money being spent and allocated in the budget towards education, again, the finance minister saying a large chunk of it is actually going to education. However, be it funding maybe higher education, there is a degree of money much better than previous budgets that has been given to basic education as well. Do you see the public school sector moving to more refined ways of the delivery of education?
So I think one of the big challenges that we currently face, and there's no doubt, and I appreciate the fact that children not in schools is a real challenge and we have to address it, but I think one of the big challenges, and you talk about refine, is that the public school will have to find a way to address the backlogs that many children, particularly kids from township schools and rural schools, have, having not had proper schooling for the last 18 months for 2 years. I think there's a recognition that many kids who went to township schools, rural schools, didn't have access to online learning, didn't have access to the kinds of resources that middle-class kids had. And that even those children have a backlog, but kids that had access to very little supplementary additional learning, had extended periods in which they came very infrequently to school, are likely to be substantially behind both the curriculum and the kind of learning outcomes that we expect. So I think there's going to be a real challenge for teachers and the system as a whole to identify ways in which we can address the backlog.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the
sorry, Prof.
things for me is that we need to have really good evidence about this. It's not sufficient that we just go ahead with it. We need to know a lot more about where learning is across our system. I
wanted to come in there, Prof, on that question of saying the backlogs and being able to address the question of backlogs. One thing that we saw with the pandemic was that we had a lot of curriculum and very short space of time to cover the curriculum. And we began to have a conversation on what needed to be left out, what content should be in that curriculum. Is there a longer-term conversation that needs to be had about that, so that it's not something that we say, oh, well, we chucked this out just because it was a pandemic, now we are back again with everything that apparently we decided at the time was actually not necessarily important to be part of the curriculum at the time?
So I think the problem is not about streamlining what's left out and what's included. I think the recognition is that we have many children who are going into grade 8 that haven't mastered the basics of mathematics and reading. So it doesn't really matter whether you're cutting out 3 or 4 topics or not. The reality is if children get to grade 7 or grade 8 in particular, and you've got a book and they aren't able to read the book, it doesn't matter whether you're only reading half the book or the whole book. The reality is they can't master any of that content. So one of the big challenges, we need to know how many children are really struggling with the basics. How many children aren't able to read in their home language, most importantly, and then English as a second language. The second thing is they need to know how many of them have mastered the basics of mathematics. These are 2 core school subjects that are a prerequisite for success across all of the subjects at the secondary school level, particularly at the grade 8, grade 9. Those are crucial years of school. Have some mastery of mathematics in order to be able to manage those 2. So the question is not about streamlining what needs to be left out and what needs to be included. We really do need to know where the children are, which children are particularly struggling, and how can we address those backlogs in order for those children to really benefit from any streamlining that may take place as we go forward.
Yeah. Rian, is there a plan, FACSA's point of view, to deal with the backlogs? 2 years of a gap. one of the studies says we are leaving a whole generation behind if we are not going to actually catch up.
Yes, I think we've really got to look earnestly at the problem. As Prof. Brahm says, we've got to figure out where we stand. But I also want to just put a red flag out and say we should not over-assess. I think that's one of the problems in the process is we constantly assess where we are without, we're teaching to the test rather than teaching for the sake of learning. And we see that the curriculum is full. Even if you streamline it, there's still a lot of assessment taking place in telling us, which learners don't understand which portion of the curriculum, but we don't use the assessment time to actually learn. So I think one of the issues that we need to address in our whole sector and the whole system is just the overemphasis of marks and assessment. Yes, we've got to test if we have learned, but we've got to learn, and we've probably got to teach kids how to learn and not just how to pass the exam, how to pass the test, how to advance to the next grade. So I think there's probably a season of change with us, post-pandemic or interpandemic, if that's the phase that we're in now, to say, what can we really change for the better, because, the whole foundation has been rocked. And I think we've got to address the backlog for sure. There's a bunch of kids, a big number of learners that have fallen behind. And what do we do to catch up? The department has produced some plans during the DBE Lekgotla to say that we've got to address the backlog. So I think the department is aware of that, but we've got to implement well. And there are a few stakeholders in that. There's the SGB at the school, there's the parents, there's the principal and the management team. And then we've got to look at our teachers. How do we capacitate our teachers to work through this and not just jump through all the hoops that the curriculum and the sector required of them pre-COVID? How do we capacitate? How do we support? How do we talk about the mental fitness and toughness and climate of our schools at this point in time? So I think the plan's got to be multifaceted, multi-layered, but we've got to at least agree that we've got a problem. We've got to celebrate where we did well, but we've also got to really look and not blame, but look at where we need to step up.
Yeah. Some said it's going to take, or it's going to need strong leadership from the front of the classroom to be able to reignite the students after this pause. You mentioned something of that nature. Now you're saying, how do we capacitate and empower those teachers to be able to do that and give that necessary leadership that is required effectively?
Yes, I think there's local leadership at a local school. One of the cornerstones of our regulatory framework is that the school is a public school, and it belongs to that public. And there's principal at the school. What we see in practice is where there's a good principal and a good leadership team working well with a strong SGB and a parent component that supports the school, things work. Yes, I understand that there are resource challenges and that sort of thing, but I think where there's a will, something happens. So we've got to capacitate through that structure and invite the community to take ownership of, it takes a village to raise a child, so let's be the village in this time. Then I think the Department of Education, along with the unions, along with professional bodies, the likes of SACE, I think there's a strong emphasis on continuous professional development, and it's a critical time for teachers, educators now to get fast-track I think exposure. Not all our learners that did not participate in remote learning and online learning and blended learning were not capacitated technologically. That's what the stats say. We had access, and yet we didn't use it. I think we need to step up with creativity, making plans to ensure that content is delivered, and maybe look at different models. I think we're definitely at a stage where different models can be reviewed. Blended learning, a portion of remote learning, maybe different hours, maybe streamlining the curriculum. So we've got many tools in our toolbox to look at this problem. But we've also got to look at the problems outside of the school. School is a reflection of society, and I think societal issues need to be addressed as well. The school nutrition program is a big issue. School transport is a big issue, and that just got highlighted during the pandemic. So I think we've got to look at it from various viewpoints.
Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. We leave it there because of the short time that we have. But thank you very much for coming on tonight. That is the South African Union for Student President, Yandisa Lubabalo, education expert, Professor Brahm Fleisch, and EXCO member and education technology manager at FETSAS, Rian van der Berg.